get out of our misery once and for all. And in my search for Russian paintings, this was a great miserable guy picture. So, those are miserable guy. Modernity proposes that knowing the root of the problem might offer the solution to the problem. That's particularly a Sigmund Freud thing. Sigmund Freud's writing in the early part of the 20th century. If we know how the watch works and what broke the watch, we might be able to fix the watch. If we know what the root cause of humanity's psychosis is, we can cure the psychosis. So Sigmund Freud, for instance, he posited that all our pathologies emerge from some cause or trigger in our childhood. Finding the trigger could lead to therapeutic healing, and thus psychoanalysis became the main bulwark of psychotherapy, which is healing of the soul. Now that's a very, very rudimentary synopsis of Freud's thought. And if you haven't looked at Freud, I highly encourage you to do so. He's a fascinating thinker. I think wrong in a lot of ways, but tremendous in other ways. So that's the synopsis of what he was suggesting. That our finding of the trigger can solve the problem. Finding the cause, the theory goes, will lead to a solution and eventual control of all things. Control of all things. But Dostoevsky, our man here, does not seem to be as concerned with motive for action, good or bad. Or perhaps more accurately, he seems to suggest that the solution to the problem doesn't lie in finding the cause. Does the solution to the problem, for instance, of flight lie in finding the cause of the bird? Does the solution to the problem of tsunamis and tornadoes lie in finding the cause of natural disaster? The modern era seems particularly keen on the idea of controlling and fixing human nature by discovering the root cause of things. You find the motive, and therefore you find the cure. And if you know, as a side note, if you've seen certain things like, for instance, that Boxing Day tsunami that was back in the early 2000s, a movie thereof called The Impossible, it's like, okay, we understand that it was a shelf that fell into the ocean that caused this huge wave, but that really didn't help anybody in those bungalows survive or deal with the aftermath. That was a terrible, terrible experience. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a wow, stunning movie called The Impossible. It stars young Spider-Man as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi and an actress. And even they can't get out of it. So, to borrow again from Wilson's article, she says, one distinctive feature of Crime and Punishment is that its real plot centers on the search not for the killer, but for a motive. Indeed, with Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky rewrote a basic facet of the detective story by eliminating the question of who committed the crime and focusing instead on the matter of why he committed the crime. As the distinguished Dostoevsky biographer Joseph Frank put it, Crime and Punishment is focused on the solution of an enigma, the mystery of Raskolnikov's motivation. Even Porfiry Petrovich, the magistrate investigating the crime, largely functions as a conduit for Raskolnikov's own desire to confess. So that begs the question, in this idea of how to get out of our misery, why does Raskolnikov kill the pawnbroker? Why does he do so? Is it, for instance, an attempt to prove the Nietzschean Übermensch in himself? Is it an attempt to strike down a wicked, cruel old lady or strike a blow against all she represents? Is it an attempt to disrupt the sensibility of others and put a finger in the eye of the last man, illusion? Is it an attempt to rid himself of the devils in his own head? I mean, he's contemplating the thing even before the novel begins, which is particularly strange. The motive for his crime remains throughout the novel unclear. Even at the beginning of the novel, perhaps before the novel begins, he's contemplating this, and perhaps it's merely a madness brought on by poverty, filth, and starvation. Perhaps it's some psychosis brought on by devils. Perhaps it's a lack of the right medication and holistic treatments of regular colonics, coupled with psychotherapy and sensitivity training. Hard to say. One way or the other, we never really get in the novel why he kills the old lady and her sister. Okay, sorry.
Well, we don't, but, well, he in the sense, he justifies himself, though, doesn't he? He talks about doing great things and using this money from this useless old woman who's exploitative and greedy and is abusive towards her younger sister.
Indeed.
So there is a sort of a justification. in his own eyes, although it's very vague, because what does he do with the money? He puts it under a rock somewhere, and you don't see, it's been many years since I read the novel, but you don't hear much about that money.
No, hardly at all.
No.
And you bring up a very, very, very good point, Doctor. I mean, he justifies his killing as being ridding the world of a very bad person, and of using the money to help his sister, and of proving that he was capable of great things like Napoleon. The problem is that he's lying to himself. And we get that very strong impression that everything he says as a reason for why he does it is an outright lie or justification for why he did it. At one point he even says, all those things I just said, they weren't true. That's not why I did it. You know, he says to Sonia, I did it for this reason. Actually, I didn't do it for that reason. I did it for this reason. Actually, that's not true. I didn't do it for that reason either. I did it for that. No, he doesn't actually have a reason. That's what's really intriguing about it, is that all the reasons that he comes up with, or the reasons other people come up with, are all justifications, but they don't get at the heart of why he actually does the thing. And really, this is, I think, very unique in, if we look at this as a murder mystery, it's very unique in murder mysteries, because most murder mysteries are, this person has this thing going on and that causes the murder. You know, Dorothy Sayers, for instance, great novelist. In all of her works, the killer has some pathology or some psychosis or some messed up thing that causes them to do what they do. Okay, very clear why they do what they do. In Agatha Christie, similar thing. The killers always have some reason or some purpose. Right? Here, we don't get that really. And that's what's really startling about this novel, is even when he says, I tried to do great things, he later recants that and says the exact opposite. And I'm going to read you, I had it handy right here, so you can just play right into my hands. He says to Sonia in part 5, chapter 4, after telling her, I did it for this reason, no, not really, this reason, that, goes through like 4 reasons. It wasn't to help my mother I did the murder. That's nonsense. I didn't do the murder to gain wealth and power and to become a benefactor of mankind. Nonsense. I simply did it. I did the murder for myself alone. Whether I became a benefactor to others or spent my life like a spider catching men in my web and sucking the life out of men, I couldn't have cared at that moment. It was not the money I wanted, Sonia, when I did it. Not so much the money I wanted, but something else. I knew it all now. I know it all now. Understand me. Perhaps I should never have committed a murder again. I wanted to find out something else. It was something else led me on. I wanted to find out then and quickly whether I was a louse like everybody else or a man, whether I could step over barriers or not, whether I dare stoop to pick up or not, whether I'm a trembling creature or whether I have a right. So he says all those reasons, that's all poppycock. That's not true. I did this because I had to prove something. To prove that I was not a last man, if you will. I'm not that sharper man that we were talking about with Blake. I had the right to be able to do this. And she says, the right to kill? Are you insane? Right? She directly contradicts him and says that that's not an excuse. You better come up with something better, buddy, because that's not good enough. Right? Later on, to his own sister, he says something similar. This is after his sister says, I'm glad that you've recognized the crime that you did and you're turning yourself in. And he says to her in part 6, chapter 7, he says, crime? Crime, he cried in sudden fear. That I killed a vile, noxious insect, an old pawnbroker woman of no use to anyone? Killing her was atonement for 40 sins. She was sucking the life out of poor people. Was that a crime? I'm not thinking of it, and I'm not thinking of expiating it, or why are you all rubbing it in on all sides? A crime, a crime. Only now I see clearly the imbecility of my cowardice. Now that I've decided to face this superfluous disgrace, it's simply because I'm contemptible, and have nothing in me that I've decided to, perhaps too for my advantage, as that Porphyry suggested. So you get a sense here that Raskolnikov himself doesn't know why he did it. And much of what he says as this is the reason I did it is actually him trying to fish for reasons, something. It's like there's this nebulous reason to cause murder, to cause violence to other people. And Dostoevsky straightens out the speaker, because we always have to separate the writer from the speaker in a novel, right? So the speaker in the novel, Dostoevsky's voice, never says this is why he did it. So even the speaker, who's a fairly omniscient speaker, never has a reason for why this occurs. And he goes on to say about this. Blood has been shed by all men, which flows and has always flowed in streams, which is spilt like champagne, and for which men are crowned in the capital and are called afterwards benefactors of mankind. Look into it more carefully and understand it. I, too, wanted to do good to men, and would have done hundreds, thousands of good deeds to make up for that one piece of stupidity. Not stupidity, even simply clumsiness, but the idea was by no means so stupid as it seems now that it has failed. Everything seems stupid when it fails. By that stupidity, I only wanted to put myself into an independent position to take the first step to obtain means, and then everything would have been smoothed over by benefits immeasurable in comparison. But I couldn't carry out even the first step because I'm contemptible. That's what's the matter. And I won't look at it as you do. If I had succeeded, I should have been crowned with glory, but now I'm trapped. See, here's the amazing thing about this novel. Dostoevsky, as I quoted from Wilson, is not so concerned with the motive for the killing. He's much more concerned with what does this type of mind look like? What does this type of soul look like? And so what we see here is not, oh, that's the reason. Well, that's the reason. You see, to quote Indiana Jones, we're digging in the wrong place when we do that. We are looking for the motive. What we're not looking at is this is a guy suffering terribly still. See, for all of this novel, he's suffering. And if we miss that point, we really haven't read to the very end of the novel, which is okay because most of us know. But the novel, he never stops that suffering. He is always suffering, not just for the crime, but for the very fact that he's fractured too. He's broken apart like every other person in the modern world. That's what Dostoevsky wants us to see. He could care less why he did it. He wants to show what this looks like. Even the jury at his trial gets it wrong, right? The jury of these learned men who are they're looking for motive, and they say, to the intense annoyance of those who maintained this opinion, the criminal scarcely attempted to defend himself. To the decisive question as to what motive impelled him to the murder and the robbery, he answered very clearly with the coarsest frankness that the cause was his miserable position, his poverty and helplessness, and his desire to provide for his first steps in life by the help of the 3,000 rubles he'd reckoned on finding. He had been led to the murder through his shallow and cowardly nature, exasperated moreover by privation and failure. To the question what led him to confess, he answered that it was heartfelt repentance. Well, this is most coarse. See, even the jury gets it wrong. They're looking for the motive. Oh, the motive of the killer is this, and the motive of the killer is that. And Raskolnikov feeds them what he thinks they want to hear. But all those reasons we see in that text, which is later on, by the way, in this about, it's not here in the text. Okay? All those reasons he's already refuted. I didn't do it for those reasons. But I'm telling the jury I did it for these reasons because that's what they want to hear, these learned men. They're looking for motive. I'll give them motive. And even after being convicted of the murder and exiled to Siberia, he still questions his motives. He says, why does my action strike them as so horrible? He said to himself. Why does the murder strike them as so horrible? I love that. Why does it strike them as so horrible? Is it because it was a crime? It wasn't a crime. My conscience is at rest. Of course, it was a legal crime. Of course, the letter of the law was broken and blood was shed. Don't punish me for the letter of the law. That's enough. Of course, in that case, many of the benefactors of mankind who snatched power for themselves instead of inheriting it ought to have been punished at their first steps. But those men succeeded, and so they were right, and I didn't, and so I had the right to have taken that step. It was only in that he recognized his criminality. Only in the fact that he had been unsuccessful and had confessed it. He suffered, too, from the question, why had he not killed himself? Why had he stood looking at the river and preferred to confess? Was the desire to live so strong, or was it so hard to overcome it? Had not Svidrigailov overcome it, although he was afraid of death? In misery, he asked himself this question and could not understand that at the very time he had been standing looking into the river, he had perhaps been dimly conscious of the fundamental falsity in himself and his convictions. He didn't understand that that consciousness might be the promise of a future crisis, of a new view of life. and of his future resurrection. Now right there, which is in the epilogue, by the way, the very last epilogue of the book, Dostoevsky's voice begins to give us an answer, which is really, he's such a genius, you know, he just holds you in suspense until the very last, oh, that's what he's getting at. So you gotta read to the end of the novel, folks, right? He's really saying, up to now we've been looking for motive, because we want to solve it too. If we find the motive, well, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not, wanting to be a Superman, so therefore I'm safe. That's the trick that Dostoevsky's playing off here. Because all of us, moderns, are seeking to find a solution to the problem too. It's natural in us, it's ingrained in us. And Dostoevsky holds us to the very last to show us that's not what we should be looking for. We should be instead looking at the suffering of the person that's in front of us. And in that moment of suffering, we might have a moment of introspection to say, am I too in need of salvation? Because that's a powerful question that mass man does not want to ask himself. Am I also in need of salvation? Our motives are frequently obscured, conflicted, complex, or inexplicable. And yet modernity, especially modern psychotherapy, continues to seek a definite cause for our behavior, good and bad, to fix broken man, to solve the problem of human existence. As the famous Kierkegaardian slogan states, life is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be experienced. He didn't actually say this, by the way, just as a side note. I was really crushed to find out that he did it. But when you go to look up your sources and they have those wiki quotes, they're like, Soren Kierkegaard said this. You're like, yeah, but where? He never said this. But it's like, I don't know. Winston Churchill said, so whatever. We'll go with it.
Churchill.
So Kierkegaard, we say, said this amazing thing. Life is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be experienced. And I think therein is the crux of what Dostoevsky is doing for us, to us, in this novel. The reality is not to find the solution, to look for why did Raskolnikov kill the old woman, and therefore we can fix it, because, I'm never going to do that. I'm a good guy. Instead, we read the entire work, which is, by the way, a suffering. And I mean that in the best sense, because somebody once said that all education is a form of suffering. The suffering of education is important. That's why you can't just read the Cliff Notes. It's because you have to suffer through the work, or the music, or the art, or the science, or whatever it is. You can't just look it up on Wikipedia. And in Greek, there's a phrase that is, what is it? How's it go? It's Prasanta Pathos Pathai Mathos. Okay, Prasanta Pathos Pathai Mathos. The experience brings about suffering. The suffering brings about wisdom. Okay? The experience brings about suffering. The suffering brings about wisdom. So what Kierkegaard is getting at, what Dostoevsky is getting at, is when you read this work, you are suffering through what Raskolnikov is suffering. And by doing so, you come to a certain level of wisdom, which is necessary as a cure for mass man. That's the secret. The wisdom is the cure for the mass man. But wisdom is only attained by suffering. If you avoid suffering, you don't get wise. You can get smart, but you won't get wise. And there's a big difference between the two. Right? Mengele was very smart. Right? Heinrich Himmler was very smart. Joseph Stalin was very smart. Their wisdom is in question. Whatever the cause might be, human life, suffering under original sin, venial sin, mortal sin, is a bit of a mess. In the back.
I just have a comment. There's a similar theme in the Oresteia trilogy, in Suffering into Truth. There's a connection.
My other great passion is the classics, so yeah, it's great. There's a great essay by Robert Fagles, I think, on the Oresteia, which if you haven't read yet, I highly encourage you to read it. Robert Fagles, it's right on that line. It's beautiful. Dostoevsky asserts that as we are forgiven by God, even in our confused dullness of the modern age of demons. We are forgiven by God. He has a character, Marmeladov, that was the guy that I showed originally, who, although alcoholic and ultimately doomed to ruin, here he is, proclaims in opposition to this dull spiritual life of modern man that there is a greater salvation than the salvation of rational scientific progress. And Marmeladov, in his drunken zeal, has this great speech that he gives about that salvation. He says about God, he will pity us, who has had pity on all men, who has understood all men and all things. He is the one, he too is the judge. He will come in that day and he will ask, where is the daughter who gave herself for her cross, consumptive stepmother, for the little children of another? Where is the daughter who had pity upon the filthy drunkard, her earthly father, undismayed by his beastliness? And he will say, come to me, I have already forgiven thee once. I have forgiven thee once. Thy sins, which are many, are forgiven, for thou hast loved much. And he will forgive my Sonia. He will forgive, I know it. I felt it in my heart when I was with her just now. He will judge and will forgive all, the good and the evil, the wise and the meek. And when he is done with all of them, then he will summon us. You too, come forth, he will say. Come forth, ye drunkards. Come forth, ye weak ones. Come forth, ye children of shame. And we shall all come forth without shame and shall stand before him. And he will say unto us, you're swine, made in the image of the beast, with this mark. But come ye also. The wise ones and those of understanding will say, O Lord, why dost thou receive these men? And he will say, this is why I receive them, O ye wise. This is why I receive them, O ye of understanding. Not one of them believed himself to be worthy of this. And he will hold out his hands to us, and he shall fall down before him. We shall fall down before him, and we shall weep, and we shall understand all things. We shall understand all, and all will be understood. All will understand. Katerina Ivanovna even, she will understand. Lord, thy kingdom come. Kind of like that Flannery O'Connor story, if you like Flannery O'Connor, right? Where I'm not a warthog from hell, right? And she's spraying the water, the warthogs and the pigs, and she sees this vision of all the people going up to heaven, all the crippled and the lame, other races. And last of all, she's going up to heaven too. It's kind of like that. Sonia, the daughter of Marmeladov, understands this great mercy of God, the sinful man. In part 4, chapter 4, she stands up to Raskolnikov's hollow unbelief and the meaninglessness he represents. I love this passage, so if I get a little verklempt, forgive me. It's a wonderful passage. Raskolnikov is tempting her and saying, look, all this bad stuff's going on. Why don't you just curse God and get it over with? It's like Job with his friends, right? Katerina Ivanovna is in consumption, rapid consumption. She would die soon, said Raskolnikov after a pause, without answering her question. Oh, no. And Sonia unconsciously clutched both his hands as though imploring that she should not. But it will be better if she does die. No, not better, not at all better. Sonia unconsciously repeated, spinning. And the children? What can you do except take them to live with you? Oh, I don't know, cried Sonia, almost in despair. She put her hands to her head. It was evident that the idea had very often occurred to her before, and he had only roused it again. And what if even now, while Katerina Ivanovna is alive, you get ill and are taken to the hospital? What will happen then? He persisted pitilessly. That cannot be. And Sonia's face worked with awful terror. God will not let it be, broke at last from her overburdened bosom. She listened, looking imploringly at him, clasping her hands in dumb entreaty as though it all depended upon him. Sonia was more confused than ever, and color rushed into her face again. She said, "No," she whispered with painful effort. "It will be the same with Polenka, no doubt," Raskolnikov said suddenly. No, it can't be." "No," Sonia cried aloud in desperation, as though she had been stabbed. "God would not allow anything so awful. It's others come to it. No, God will protect her, God," she repeated herself beside herself. "But perhaps there is no God at all," Raskolnikov answered with a sort of malignance, laughed, looked at him. Sonia's face suddenly changed. A tremor passed over it. She looked at him with unutterable reproach. Tried to say something, but could not speak, and broke into bitter sobs, hiding her face in her hands. "So you pray to God a great deal, Sonia?" he asked her. Sonia did not speak. He stood beside her, waiting for an answer. "What should I be without God?" she whispered back, forcibly, glancing at him with suddenly flashing eyes and squeezing his hand. "Ah, so that is it," he thought. "And what does God do for you?" he asked, probing her further. Sonia was silent a long while, as though she could not answer. Her weak chest kept heaving with emotion. "Be silent. Don't ask. You don't deserve," he cried suddenly, looking sternly and wrathfully at him. That's it, he repeated to himself. "He does everything." See, the novel is about crime. It's not about crime. It's not even about crimes, is it? That is, the most various crimes of lust, and pride, and envy, and wrath, and all those others. It's not even about the punishing despair that we're all guilty of. The greatness of the novel is that it gives voice to the meaninglessness of the modern world, the emptiness of mass man existence, the murderous nature of an age of devils, but it also proclaims that God in his mercy plucks us out of the burning of life. When we commit crimes, small or great, it seems as though the hand of God comes down on us in judgmental punishment. But the reality is that our punishment is our wounding of ourselves, and that God in his infinite mercy uses the punishment to effect our redemption. Dostoevsky's novel then operates like a Felix culpa. Great phrase, Felix culpa, comes from the Exultet originally, which I won't sing here. O Felix culpa quae talam ac tantum meruit habere redemptorum. O happy fault that earned for us so great, so glorious a redeemer. The punishment, all that Raskolnikov goes through, all of this, burns from him the numbing tendencies to be a last man, and allows him instead to become the new man in Christ. It's therefore a great gift, Dostoevsky seems to suggest, that there is no easy solution or escape from the problems we've created for ourselves in the modern world. The paradox, he seems to suggest, is that the only escape from misery is to embrace the misery until we recognize it as a gift from God. Ultimately, there's no simple pill. There's no program, no therapy that can help us escape from the misery of life, Dostoevsky says. But escape is not the plan. There's a new superior life of joy and freedom and real love that comes after great striving, great suffering, and great punishment. Now I'm going to end tonight with the last quotation from the book. Rodion did not know that the new life would not be given him for nothing, that he would have to pay dearly for it, that it would cost him great striving, great suffering. That is the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration, of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new, unknown life. That might be the subject of a new story, but our present story